What if the reason you haven't finished your biggest dream isn't laziness, lack of discipline, or lack of motivation? What if you're trapped by the need to do it perfectly? Because perfectionism doesn't always look like success. Sometimes, it looks like endless planning, constant editing, and never actually starting or finishing. And the most dangerous part? The perfection trap can make you feel productive, while quietly keeping you stuck. Welcome to this explainer.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here because we are tackling a universal frustration today. We're going to explore why so many of us struggle to cross the finish line on our projects. We're talking about the perfection trap and why we're so incredibly good at starting things but just can't seem to get them done. So, if you've ever felt completely stuck, you are definitely in the right place. So let's dive right in with a question we've literally all asked ourselves while staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. Why do I start things but never finish them? Think about it for a second. That half-read book sitting on your nightstand, the online course you totally abandoned at lesson 5, or, that brilliant business idea still locked inside a notebook from 3 years ago. We look at these things and we feel this massive amount of guilt, right? We wonder if we're not smart enough or if we're just completely lacking discipline. But I want to validate that guilt for you right now, because as we're about to see, this is not about you being flawed. It's all about how your brain is wired.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the unfinished task burden, then compare starting excitement versus finishing friction. Next, we'll uncover perfectionism as the hidden obstacle, dive into the science of delay, and finally, give you some concrete strategies to get to done.
All right, part 1, the unfinished task burden.
Have you ever wondered why your brain just won't let go of an unfinished project? Well, it comes down to something called the Zygarnik effect. This is based on a really fascinating 1927 study by a Russian psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik. In her study, people were asked to complete a set of tasks, but for some of them, they were intentionally interrupted before they could finish. And guess what? Later on, they remembered the interrupted tasks at a way higher rate than the ones they actually finished. It turns out our cognitive system has this powerful, hardwired need for closure. When a task is left hanging, your brain literally gets stuck on it. It generates these intrusive thoughts to remind you that something is pending, and that slowly but surely builds up as this lingering background guilt in your life.
Moving on to part 2, starting excitement versus finishing friction. Think about the sheer rush of starting something new. It's so easy for our brains, right? You get this massive dopamine rush. It's filled with novelty and high hopes. The early stages hide all the complexity, and crucially, there's zero exposure to criticism. But finishing is a whole different beast. It requires us to tolerate some really uncomfortable friction. The stimulation decreases, the novelty completely fades, and it demands absolute commitment. And worst of all, finishing invites evaluation. In our modern world, where shiny new distractions are everywhere, it is biologically so much easier to just start a brand new project to get that quick dopamine hit again, rather than push through the painful friction of actually finishing.
But here is the absolute game changer you need to take away from this. Leaving things unfinished is not laziness. It's actually a self-regulatory failure. This comes straight from a massive meta-analysis by Dr. Piers Steele, who analyzed nearly 700 correlations. He found that procrastination is the quintessential self-regulatory failure. It's not a character flaw. It doesn't mean you lack morals. It's strictly an issue with how we regulate our impulses and how we tolerate the sheer unpleasantness of a task. It's a documented psychological failure in self-regulation.
Which brings us to part 3, perfectionism, the hidden obstacle. I want you to really let this statement sink in for a moment. Unfinished work cannot be evaluated. So many of us assume that perfectionists are these flawless finishers who get everything done perfectly. But the research shows the exact opposite. Perfectionism often masquerades as having high standards, but in reality, it's a super subtle defense mechanism. Think about it. If you never finish your novel, it can't be criticized. If you never launch your business, it can't fail. But endlessly editing, tweaking, and postponing, you're keeping your potential perfectly safe from the real world. Your perfectionism protects your ego for sure, but it locks your potential in an unfinished state forever.
Let's look at the hard data in Part 4, the science of delay.
Let's look at some numbers from a study on young adults published in the International Journal of Drug Delivery Technology. There's a towering mean score for procrastination here, sitting at a massive 62.33. Now, look right next to it. The second highest score is self-critical perfectionism, at nearly 57. The researchers found a highly significant positive correlation here. Basically, as perfectionism increases, especially the self-critical kind, procrastination directly goes up with it. The data clearly shows that an excessive fear of making mistakes literally paralyzes us.
Let's break down the nuances of that a little bit. Psychology actually categorizes perfectionism into three main dimensions. First, we have rigid perfectionism, which is about being super rule-bound and strict. But the two that really drive our failure to finish are self-critical and narcissistic perfectionism. Self-critical perfectionism involves incredibly harsh self-evaluation and just an intense fear of making mistakes. Narcissistic perfectionism, on the other hand, is all about seeking validation and perceiving yourself as superior. The study found that both of these are strongly linked to procrastination. And why? Because that intense fear of failure, judgment, and not living up to this flawless self-image makes completing a task feel incredibly dangerous to our ego.
Dr. Piers Steele ties all of this together beautifully with something called temporal motivation theory. Essentially, this theory states that we delay action when a task lacks an immediate reward or, and this is the absolute key part for perfectionists, when we doubt our ability to succeed. When that initial dopamine novelty wears off and the friction sets in, if your perfectionism makes you doubt that you can execute the project flawlessly, your motivation absolutely plummets. Your brain just decides, you know what, it's safer to just stop.
All right, let's fix this. Part 5, strategies to get to done. Okay, we need to talk about this concept from clinical psychologist Dr. Alice Boyce. She brilliantly calls it the lemongrass problem, and it is so relatable. Picture this. You're cleaning out your fridge. You throw away 90% of all the expired food, but for some reason, you leave this rotting stick of lemongrass you bought 3 weeks ago for a recipe you never ended up making. Why do we do that? Because you're holding on to your ideal self, the version of you who cooks fancy, intricate dinners, rather than accepting your real self who is honestly never going to use it. And we do this exact same thing with our projects. We hold on to unfinished tasks because letting them go or just finishing them poorly means confronting our real imperfect selves instead of our ideal limitless potential. To finish things, we first have to accept our real capacity.
So the goal is building systems that bypass that perfectionism. Here are 4 incredibly practical steps from Dr. Boyce's anti-procrastination toolkit. First, do the last steps first. If you have a huge project, write the final submission email first. It totally reduces the friction at the finish line when you're the most exhausted. Second, use heuristics, which is basically a fancy word for setting strict rules. Like, I will always throw out any container in the fridge with less than 2 tablespoons left. No overthinking it, just doing it. Third, share tasks with good finishers. If you know you're a great starter, tag in someone who loves tying up loose ends. Finally, use compassionate self-talk. Perfectionism-induced exhaustion happens when you go too hard and critique yourself way too much. Cutting yourself a little slack actually improves your self-regulation.
I'm going to leave you with one final provocative question to think about today. Are you ready to trade the safety of your potential for the reality of completion? Keeping things unfinished feels really safe. It protects your identity, but it deprives the world of your actual, tangible work. It's time to stop chasing the shifting novelty of new ideas, push past that fear, and allow yourself the messy, totally uncomfortable, but deeply rewarding reality of crossing the finish line.